When Lieutenant Ayako Yamamoto surrendered her bullet-riddled reconnaissance plane to American forces in the Philippines in late 1944, she expected death. What she found instead was a Kansas wheat field that would destroy everything she thought she knew about women, war, and the world. Lieutenant Ayako Yamamoto had been an anomaly from birth, a third daughter in a family that desperately needed sons. Her father, a decorated Imperial Navy officer, had watched her with a mixture of pride and disappointment as she excelled in mathematics and engineering, subjects that should have belonged to the brothers who never came. When the war intensified and the military began its experimental Women's Auxiliary Flight Corps, he had pulled strings to get her accepted, though he never quite looked her in the eye when discussing it. "You will serve the Emperor," he had told her before she shipped out, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken apology. "But remember, you are still a woman. Do not shame us by forgetting your place." The Women's Flight Corps had been a carefully controlled experiment, born of desperation as Japan's pilot losses mounted. They flew reconnaissance missions, transport runs, weather observation, never combat, always carefully chaperoned, their existence barely acknowledged in official records. Ayako and her fellow pilots lived in a strange liminal space, honored for their service yet whispered about in barracks, praised for their skill yet reminded constantly that they were merely filling a temporary gap until proper men could resume their rightful roles. Her instructors had been dismissive at best, hostile at worst. Women lack the spatial reasoning for complex maneuvers, one had declared, even as Ayako consistently outperformed her male counterparts in navigation exercises. "Your emotions will betray you in crisis," another warned, though he himself had washed out of combat duty for panic attacks. But the propaganda about American women that had been universal, enthusiastic, and constant. The educational films showed American women as painted dolls in impractical clothing, their primary concerns limited to cosmetics and entertainment. Radio broadcasts mocked their supposed helplessness, their dependence on men for every decision. "The American woman," one particularly memorable lecture had proclaimed, "is a decorative object, pampered and useless. Their men keep them weak deliberately. It is the rot at the heart of their democracy. While our women support the nation through proper feminine duties, theirs waste resources on frivolity. When their men are gone to war, their society will collapse like rice paper in rain." The newspapers had been filled with stories of American women weeping in their luxurious homes, unable to cope with rationing that was a fraction of what Japanese civilians endured daily. Political cartoons showed them fainting at the sight of work, demanding servants they could no longer afford, throwing tantrums over stockings and chocolates while the world burned. Ayako had believed it all, even as the irony gnawed at her. She was, after all, a Japanese woman doing what the propaganda insisted only men could do. But she had reconciled this contradiction the way her society demanded. She was an exception, a temporary aberration born of crisis, proof of Japanese adaptability rather than a challenge to natural order. And besides, she told herself, she knew her place. She deferred to male officers, maintained proper feminine modesty, accepted that her service was conditional and temporary. American women, the propaganda insisted, didn't even understand the concept of knowing one's place. By late 1944, the missions had become increasingly desperate. Fuel shortages meant flights were planned to the last liter. Maintenance was deferred. Spare parts were non-existent. When Ayako's reconnaissance plane had been hit by American fighters over Leyte, the engine already sputtering from contaminated fuel, she had three choices: crash into the ocean, attempt a landing in Japanese-held jungle where survival was unlikely, or surrender to the Americans. She had chosen surrender and expected death. The Americans who had taken her into custody had been bewilderingly correct. No torture, no summary execution, no sexual assault. All the things she had been promised would happen to female prisoners. Instead, there had been medical treatment for her injuries, surprisingly adequate food, and a strange, almost embarrassed courtesy from the male soldiers who processed her. "Ma'am," they had called her, as if she were a real officer deserving of respect rather than a woman playing at war. The other prisoners, all men from various corners of the collapsing Japanese empire, had been as confused as she was. They whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile the propaganda with the reality of clean camps, adequate rations, and Geneva Convention procedures. Some insisted it was an elaborate trick, that the real horrors would begin soon. Others, particularly those who had been starving in the jungle for months, seemed too grateful for regular meals to question their fortune. Ayako had kept to herself, wrestling with her own confusion. The American military machine she glimpsed through her captivity was nothing like what she'd been told to expect. The casual waste of resources, fresh water for bathing daily, bread thrown away if slightly stale, fuel used seemingly without thought for conservation would have been shocking enough. But it was the women she saw in the camps, the nurses and administrators, that truly unsettled her. They moved with confidence. They gave orders to male subordinates who obeyed without question. They operated vehicles, managed logistics, made decisions. And the American men, didn't seem to find this strange at all. "Where are you sending me?" she had asked the pleasant-faced Red Cross worker who processed her final transfer paperwork in early 1945. "Stateside," the woman replied, stamping forms with practiced efficiency. "Kansas. Agricultural Work Program. We're short on farm labor with so many men overseas. You'll be housed with other POWs, but you'll work on local farms during the day. It's good work, healthy, and Lord knows the farmers need the help." Kansas. Ayako had tried to find it on a mental map of America and failed. The name meant nothing. Agricultural work, well, that made sense. Even American propaganda had never pretended their women could do hard physical labor. She would likely be picking vegetables under the supervision of elderly men, she imagined, doing the kind of simple work that even pampered American women considered beneath them. She could not have been more wrong. The truck that collected Ayako and 3 other Japanese POWs from the railway station in Lawrence, Kansas, was driven by a woman. This in itself was mildly surprising but not shocking. Even in Japan, some women drove in wartime, though it was considered vaguely improper. But this woman drove the way men drove, casually confident, one arm hanging out the window, taking corners faster than seemed necessary, the truck's gears shifting smoothly under her practiced hand. "Name's Margaret Brennan," she announced without preamble, her accent strange to Ayako's ears, shaped by textbooks written in East Coast American English. "Most folks call me Maggie. You 4 are assigned to my farm for the duration. We run wheat, corn, some dairy cattle, about 800 acres. Harvest season's coming up, and I need hands who aren't afraid of real work." She looked at them appraisingly through the rear-view mirror, her eyes, startlingly blue, showing neither hostility nor excessive friendliness. Just assessment, the way a carpenter might examine lumber. "You boys understand English?" The 3 male prisoners nodded hesitantly. Ayako, whose education had included extensive English instruction, found herself nodding as well, before remembering that she should let the men speak first. Good. Saves time on translation. Rules are simple. Work hard. Don't try to run. Not that there's anywhere to run to in Kansas. You'd just die of exposure or get picked up in an hour. Respect the property and equipment, and we'll all get along fine. Food's good, quarters are clean, and I pay the government rate for your labor, which means you'll have some money when this damn war ends, and you go home. One of the men, emboldened by her directness, asked hesitantly, "Your farm, your husband?" Maggie's laugh was sharp and not entirely pleasant. "Husband's in Italy with Patton. Farm's mine, was mine before the war, will be mine after. Inherited it from my father, built it up from a struggling section to a profitable operation. Any other questions about the chain of command?" Silence. "Didn't think so." The drive to the Brennan farm took 40 minutes, during which Ayako stared out the window at a landscape that seemed to her eyes almost offensively fertile. The propaganda had never mentioned how green America was, how the fields stretched to the horizon in geometric precision, how the farmhouses stood solid and painted, each with multiple outbuildings suggesting a level of material abundance she had never seen in rural Japan. The Brennan farm was larger than Ayako had imagined and far more mechanized. As the truck pulled up the long gravel drive, she saw equipment that would have served an entire Japanese village, a massive red tractor that looked like it could pull down mountains, a combine harvester that seemed impossibly complex, a grain elevator that towered over the barn, trucks and tractors and mysterious machines lined up with the precision of a military motor pool. "Jesus," one of the male prisoners whispered in Japanese. "Look at all that machinery, just for one farm. She said 800 acres, another replied, trying to maintain face through analysis. That's very large. Probably several families working together, using her name for the processing. But as they unloaded from the truck and Maggie led them on a brief tour before showing them to their quarters, it became increasingly clear that there were no several families. There was Maggie, one hired man too old for military service who lived in a cottage on the property, and now the 4 POWs. That was the entire workforce for an agricultural operation that would have required a small village in Japan. Their quarters were in a converted bunkhouse, simple but clean, with real beds, a wood stove, and even a small bathroom with running water. It was better accommodation than Ayako had experienced in most of her military postings. Supper's at 6, Maggie informed them, handing each a work assignment sheet. You'll be working different rotations. I need people on milking duty, fence repair, equipment maintenance, and starting next week, harvest operations. You'll rotate duties so everyone learns everything. I don't tolerate laziness, but I don't tolerate abuse of my workers either. Questions? Ayako found her voice, curiosity overcoming propriety. The machines. Who operates them? Maggie's smile was thin. I do. Though you'll all learn too, assuming you prove you can handle it. Good equipment operators are worth their weight in gold right now. That night, lying in her bunk while the 3 men played cards at the small table, Ayako struggled to process what she had seen. The farm was real, the machinery was real, and Maggie Brennan, confident, competent, utterly in command, was very real. She cannot possibly operate all that equipment, one of the men muttered in Japanese, believing Ayako asleep. It's propaganda, a show. The old man probably does the real work. Maybe, another replied doubtfully. But did you see her hands? Those are working hands. My sister married a farmer. I know what work does to hands. American tricks, the first insisted. You'll see. Tomorrow, the real situation will become clear. But tomorrow, the real situation only became more confusing. Ayako's first assigned duty was helping with the dairy cattle, a job she approached with the confidence of someone who had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother's rural childhood. How different could American cows be from Japanese cows? Very different, as it turned out. The Holstein dairy cattle on the Brennan farm were enormous, each animal producing more milk in a day than Ayako had thought biologically possible. The milking was done with electric machines that attached directly to the animals, pumping milk into refrigerated tanks through a system of pipes that seemed almost science-fictional in its efficiency. Maggie demonstrated the process once, her movements economical and practiced. Clean the udder with this solution, attach the cups like so, watch the flow to make sure it's steady, detach when the flow slows, dip the teats with this antiseptic. 20 cows twice a day takes about 90 minutes if you work efficiently. Questions? Ayako had dozens of questions but asked none, overwhelmed by the mechanical complexity and the casual way Maggie handled animals that could easily kill a person with one kick. By the end of the first week, Ayako had learned to operate the milking machines, muck out stalls with a mechanical scraper, and repair the fence line using tools she could barely lift. Her body, hardened by military training, nonetheless ached in new ways. Her hands, which had known control sticks and navigation instruments, learned blisters and calluses. And every day, she watched Maggie Brennan. The woman was everywhere, doing everything. She woke before dawn to check the animals, spent the morning on machinery maintenance, the afternoon on bookkeeping and business calls, the evening on equipment operation or repairs. She drove the massive tractor with the same casual skill she drove the truck, maneuvering complicated attachments with precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Most folks don't realize farming's about 50% machinery operation now, Maggie commented one day, catching Ayako staring as she rebuilt a carburetor at the workshop bench. At least, farming at scale, sure, you can run a small plot with hand tools and animal power, but to make it commercially viable, you need equipment. You need to understand engines, hydraulics, metallurgy, electrical systems. My father taught me all of it, said he'd rather have one competent daughter than 3 useless sons. She glanced at Ayako with something that might have been amusement. You look surprised. In Japan, Ayako said carefully, women do not typically. operate heavy machinery, run businesses, make decisions. Maggie's laugh was dry. Yeah, I've heard. Different worlds. Though I'll tell you, plenty of American men wish their world looked more like yours. My husband's family barely spoke to him for 2 years after we married because I wouldn't sell the farm and become a proper housewife. His mother still sends me magazine clippings about appropriate feminine behavior. She wiped her hands on a rag, considering Ayako with those unsettling blue eyes. You're the pilot, right? The prisoner manifest said you actually flew planes. Ayako nodded, waiting for mockery or disbelief. How'd you get into that? Can't imagine the Japanese military was thrilled about women pilots. They said it was temporary, emergency measure, not real combat flying, just reconnaissance and transport. But you flew. You navigated. You understood the machinery. Yes, and you were good at it, or you wouldn't have been flying this late in the war when they must have been down to their most reliable people. It wasn't a question, but Ayako answered anyway. I was adequate. Maggie snorted. Bet you were better than adequate. Bet you were damn good, and it drove somebody crazy. Let me guess, every man you outperformed told you it was luck or instinct, that you couldn't possibly understand the real technical aspects? The accuracy of this was so painful that Ayako felt her throat tighten. She managed a small nod. Yeah. Maggie turned back to the carburetor, her movements methodical. I get that. Different uniform, same story. You want to learn how to operate the tractor? What? The tractor, you've got a good mechanical sense. I've watched you with the milking machines. You understand how systems work. And you're strong enough if you don't try to muscle through things that require leverage instead. Tractors sitting idle because I can't be in 2 places at once, and hiring operators is damn near impossible right now. You interested? Ayako's mind reeled. This was a violation of every rule she had ever learned about proper behavior, about POW restrictions, about her place as a woman in a world that didn't want women in such roles. She should decline. She should show proper humility. She should. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I would like to learn. The International Harvester Farmall M was, in its way, as complex as any reconnaissance plane Ayako had flown. It had a 4-cylinder engine producing 36 horsepower, a 5-speed transmission, hydraulic lift for implements, and a power takeoff system that could drive auxiliary equipment. It weighed over 3 tons and could pull loads that would have required a dozen draft horses. Maggie taught Ayako to operate it the way a master craftsman teaches an apprentice, methodically, building understanding layer by layer. First rule, respect the machine. It's not smart, it won't save you from stupid decisions, and it can kill you in about 6 different ways if you're careless. Second rule, smooth is fast. Jerky movements waste fuel, damage equipment, and tire you out. Third rule, always know where your implement is. The tractor might fit through a gap, but if you're pulling a 12-foot harrow, you're going to tear something expensive. They started with operation in an empty field. Ayako learning the clutch engagement, the gear shifts, the way the steering required more planning than an automobile because of the momentum and power involved. Then came implement attachment, the complex dance of backing up to equipment, aligning the 3-point hitch, connecting hydraulic lines and power takeoff shafts. Most men I've tried to teach get impatient, Maggie observed one afternoon as Ayako carefully aligned the tractor with a cultivator for the 20th time. They want to just ram it into position, use force instead of finesse. You're actually thinking about angles and leverage. It's refreshing. By the 3rd week, Ayako was doing real work, cultivating between crop rows, pulling the hay wagon, operating the grain auger. The other POWs watched with a mixture of admiration and discomfort as she maneuvered the massive tractor with growing confidence. It's not proper, one of them muttered one evening. A woman operating such equipment. What will people think? People will think the field got plowed, Ayako replied, surprising herself with her sharpness. What does propriety matter when there's work to be done? But even as she said it, she felt the internal contradiction tearing at her. Everything she had been taught about proper feminine behavior screamed that this was wrong. Women should be gentle, deferential, focused on domestic duties. Operating heavy machinery, making decisions about equipment and workflow, understanding mechanical systems, these were male domains. Crossing into them was crossing into chaos. Yet here was Maggie Brennan doing all of this and more, and her world had not collapsed into chaos. The farm functioned with remarkable efficiency. The animals were healthy, the equipment maintained, the crops thriving. There were no men swooping in to save her from her incompetence, because there was no incompetence to save her from. And the really disturbing part, the part that kept Ayako awake at night, was that Maggie wasn't even particularly unusual by American standards. The other farmers who stopped by, and in the spring and summer there was a constant flow of neighbors borrowing equipment, sharing labor, exchanging information, were mostly women. Not all of them, but enough that it clearly wasn't an aberration. They drove their own trucks, negotiated their own deals, made their own decisions. Some had husbands overseas, but others were unmarried or widowed, and they managed nonetheless. Martha down the road runs nearly 2,000 acres with her daughter and 3 POWs, Maggie mentioned casually one day. Best wheat yields in the county. Her husband died in '42. Everyone expected her to sell, but she just kept going. Bought a new combine last year, paid cash. The male POWs struggled with this reality in various ways. One became sullen and withdrawn, barely speaking. Another tried to maintain the fantasy that this was somehow temporary or unusual, that these American women were aberrations who would return to proper roles once the war ended. The third, a farmer himself in his previous life, seemed to have a quiet crisis of faith that he worked through by throwing himself into the work with near manic intensity. Ayako found herself somewhere between denial and acceptance, her worldview cracking like spring ice. The wheat harvest began in late June, and with it came the true test of the farm's efficiency and Ayako's new skills. Harvesting wheat at the Brennan farm scale was an industrial operation. The combine harvester, a massive machine that cut, threshed, and cleaned the grain in one continuous operation, was so complex that Ayako initially believed it must require a crew to operate. But Maggie ran it alone, traversing the golden fields in systematic patterns, while Ayako and the others shuttled trucks to collect the harvested grain and ferry it to the storage elevators. The coordination required was intricate. The combine had to maintain optimal speed and settings for the crop conditions. The trucks had to arrive precisely when the combine's grain tank was full, neither too early nor too late. The grain elevator operations had to process the incoming wheat efficiently. Weather had to be monitored constantly. Rain could ruin a partially harvested field, so when conditions were right, they worked until dark and sometimes beyond. Maggie taught Ayako to operate the combine on the 4th day of harvest. "I need to be able to run 2 machines," she explained, her face showing the strain of days of intensive work. "You know machinery. You understand the principles. The combine's just a more complex version of what you already know." It was both true and a dramatic understatement. The combine was a symphony of moving parts: the reel that gathered the wheat, the cutter bar that severed the stalks, the auger that moved material into the threshing mechanism, the cleaning shoe that separated grain from chaff, the grain tank, the unloader auger. All of these had to be monitored and adjusted constantly based on crop conditions, ground speed, grain moisture, dozens of variables. But Ayako found to her own surprise that she could do it. The principles were indeed familiar. It was about understanding systems, monitoring feedback, making continuous small adjustments rather than dramatic corrections. Her military training had taught her to process multiple information streams simultaneously, to stay calm when managing complex machinery, to trust her instruments and her training. By the end of the first day operating the combine, she had mastered basic technique. By the end of the first week, she was operating at nearly Maggie's efficiency level, and somewhere in those long days, traversing the endless golden fields with the sun beating down and the grain flowing into the tank like a river of wealth, something fundamental shifted in Ayako's understanding of the world. This was power, not the abstract power of rank or social position, but real, tangible power, the power to transform raw earth into wealth, to command machines that did the work of hundreds of men, to make decisions that affected thousands of acres and the prosperity of an entire region. And it was power that had nothing to do with gender, with social expectations, with propaganda about proper feminine roles. It was simply competence, skill, knowledge, will. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a particularly long day, Maggie brought out cold lemonade and gestured at the freshly harvested fields. "We'll finish tomorrow," she said with satisfaction. "Best yield I've had in 5 years. The POW labor program's been a godsend. I couldn't have managed it alone, not with the equipment maintenance and everything else." In Japan, Ayako said slowly, the words coming from some deep place of honesty she didn't entirely control, "They told us American women were weak, helpless, that your society kept you as decorative objects, useless and pampered." Maggie's laugh was loud and genuine. "Jesus. Well, I suppose we tell our own stories about other places." "Propaganda's propaganda, doesn't matter which flag it's wrapped in." She paused, considering. "Though I'll tell you, there's plenty of American men who'd prefer we fit that description. My husband's father still introduces me as the wife, rather than by name, and we've been married 12 years. The county extension agent tried to explain tractor maintenance to me last year. I've been operating tractors since I was 13. It's not like America's some kind of paradise for women who want to do real work." "But you can," Ayako said. "You're allowed. You run this farm. You operate this equipment. You make these decisions, and no one stops you." True enough, though allowed is a complicated word. My father's will was bulletproof, so nobody could take the farm from me legally. I had enough money to maintain independence, and I was stubborn enough to tell the whole county to go to hell when they suggested I should find a man to manage things properly. She sipped her lemonade. "Lot of women don't have those advantages. Lot of women here are just as trapped as you suggest, just in prettier cages. But it is possible. That is the difference." "I suppose it is." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the harvested fields gold and crimson. "What will you do?" Maggie asked finally. "After the war, assuming you survive whatever comes next, and I hope you do. You're a damn good worker." Ayako had no answer. The future was a void, unimaginable. Return to Japan certainly, but to what? Her place in the military had been temporary, emergency only. She would be expected to marry, to serve her family through proper womanly duties, to forget that she had ever known the control stick of a reconnaissance plane or the steering wheel of a tractor. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything I knew about the world has been proven false. I don't know what remains." "You know what you're capable of," Maggie said firmly. "That's not nothing. Whether they let you use it or not, that's the world's failure, not yours. Remember that." In August, the Red Cross provided POWs with the opportunity to send brief letters home, carefully censored, but nonetheless the first communication Ayako had been able to send to her family since her capture. She sat for hours with pen and paper, struggling to find words that could traverse not just the physical distance, but the conceptual gap that had opened in her understanding. "Honorable Father, I am well and treated according to international standards. The work is agricultural, physically demanding, but not unreasonable. The food is adequate, and the conditions better than many military postings I experienced." All of that was true, but utterly inadequate, describing reality while saying nothing true. She started again. "Honorable Father, I have learned to operate machines I did not know existed. I have seen agricultural productivity that would seem like fantasy in our homeland. I have worked under the supervision of a woman who runs 800 acres with the kind of competence I saw in our best officers. Everything we were told about American weakness appears to have been a lie, or at least such a distortion of truth as to become lie. Their women are not decorative objects. Their society has not collapsed without men. Indeed, their women step into men's roles with a facility that suggests the boundaries between those roles were always more artificial than natural. I do not know what to make of this. I do not know what to make of anything anymore." She crumpled that version, her hands shaking. What could she say that would survive the censors? What could she say that her father would understand? What could she say that wouldn't sound like the raving of someone who had abandoned not just her country, but her sanity? In the end, she wrote something brief and formulaic, expressing appropriate sentiments and revealing nothing. But late that night, she wrote a different letter, one she would never send but needed to write nonetheless. "Honorable Father, you taught me that a woman's place was circumscribed by natural law, by social necessity, by the requirements of order and harmony. You pulled strings to place me in military service, but only because the war demanded it, and you reminded me always that my service was contingent, temporary, an aberration to be forgotten when normalcy returned. I have spent months on a farm in America, and I have learned that everything you taught me was not law, but preference, not natural, but constructed, not inevitable, but chosen. I have operated machinery more powerful than anything in our military arsenal, and I was not struck down by divine punishment. I have made decisions affecting thousands of yen in agricultural productivity, and the crops did not wither at my female touch. I have worked under the command of a woman who runs her enterprise with more skill than most of the male officers I served, and the heavens have not fallen. I do not write this with anger, but with profound grief. You limited me. Limited all of us, all the daughters and sisters and wives who could have been more, because you believed certain limits were real when they were merely enforced. You crippled us and called it protection. You chained us and called it proper order. I do not know if I can ever forgive that. I do not know if I should. I will return to Japan when the war ends because I have no choice and because it is still my homeland. But I will return as someone different, someone who has seen what is possible, and I do not think I can ever again pretend that those possibilities do not exist, cannot exist, should not exist. You taught me duty. You taught me honor. You taught me service. America has taught me competence. It has taught me that skill has no gender, that machines do not care who operates them, that the only real limitations are the ones we accept. I wish you had taught me that instead. She folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of a book, knowing she would carry it forever, never sending it, but needing it to exist nonetheless as testament to the person she had become. By September, the rhythms of the farm had become familiar, almost comfortable. Ayako had progressed from basic tractor operation to more complex tasks, managing the hay baler, coordinating harvest logistics, even maintaining some of the simpler machinery. The work was never easy, but it was comprehensible, and there was satisfaction in seeing tangible results of labor. The war news, when it filtered through to their isolated corner of Kansas, was increasingly dire for Japan. The other prisoners grew more somber as the summer progressed, their movements acquiring the heavy quality of men who knew their cause was lost, but could not yet admit it. Ayako found herself oddly detached from it all. The war that had defined her life for so long seemed to belong to a different person, a different world. The ideologies that had driven millions to die now seemed as abstract and meaningless as philosophical debates about how many angels could dance on a pin. What was concrete was the wheat in the fields, the milk in the tanks, the machinery that transformed human effort into productivity. What was real was competence, skill, the satisfaction of work done well. "You've gotten quiet," Maggie observed one morning as they worked together on replacing the combine's cutter bar sections, preparing the machine for the next season. "I am thinking." Dangerous habit, but Maggie's tone was understanding rather than mocking. About the war. About what comes after, when Japan surrenders, and they will surrender, yes? Even our pride cannot sustain us against your industrial capacity forever. Eventually, yes, though at what cost is anyone's guess. When that happens, I will return home. I will be expected to resume my place. Marry appropriately, serve my family, forget that I was ever anything but a proper woman. Ayako's hands continued their work, tightening bolts with practiced precision. But I have learned things that cannot be unlearned, seen things that cannot be unseen. The question is what you do with that knowledge. I do not know if there is anything I can do. Japanese society is not like America. The boundaries are not negotiable. Maggie considered this, her weathered hand steady on the wrench. My grandmother came from Sweden in 1880, 18 years old, spoke maybe 50 words of English, married a man she'd met twice. Everyone told her American farm life would be impossible for someone of her refined background. She helped build our first barn herself, learned to shoot to protect the livestock from wolves, taught herself English from newspapers. She always said the question wasn't whether the boundaries were negotiable. It was whether you could survive the cost of negotiating them. And could she survive the cost? She died at 87, respected, prosperous, and surrounded by grandchildren who thought she was the toughest person they'd ever known. But yeah, there were costs. She was never fully accepted by the community. Her children had to fight twice as hard to prove themselves. Some of her family back in Sweden never spoke to her again. Maggie paused, looking directly at Ayako. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. Your country, your culture, your life. I don't presume to understand what you'll be facing, but I will tell you this. Competence is a kind of currency. It can't buy you everything, but it's worth more than people realize. You know how to operate complex machinery. You understand agricultural systems. You can manage logistics and maintenance. Those are real, valuable skills. Skills that Japanese society does not value in women. Maybe not now, but things change. Wars change things. I've heard enough about Japan's situation to know they're going to need every capable person they have when reconstruction begins. Maybe there will be room for someone who knows how to rebuild, how to operate machinery, how to manage productivity. Or maybe there will be room only for those who know their place and keep to it. Maybe, Maggie acknowledged. But at least you'll know what you're capable of. At least you'll know the truth about those boundaries. Whether you can challenge them or not, at least you'll know they're constructed, not natural. That's worth something. Was it? Ayako wasn't sure. Knowledge could be a burden as easily as a liberation, especially knowledge that revealed how much of one's suffering was unnecessary, artificial, maintained by willful blindness. But Maggie was right about one thing. She could not unknow what she had learned. She could not unsee what she had seen. The propaganda had promised her that American women were weak, helpless, decorative, and that promise had been as substantial as morning mist. The reality was a Kansas wheat field, a woman operating a combine harvester with casual mastery, 800 acres of productive land managed with the kind of efficiency that would have seemed miraculous in Japan. The reality was that competence had no gender, that skill could not be bound by social expectations, that the limits she had accepted all her life were not laws of nature, but merely laws of men, and laws of men could be changed. Whether she would have the courage or opportunity to apply that knowledge when she returned to Japan, that remained to be seen, but she would carry it with her nonetheless. A subversive seed planted in consciousness, impossible to fully suppress no matter how deeply she might be forced to bury it. The war ended in August 1945, though it would be months before Ayako and the other prisoners were repatriated. By the time the paperwork was processed and transport arranged, it was late October, and the farm had been through another full season of planting and early harvest preparation. On her last day at the Brennan farm, Ayako rose before dawn out of habit and found Maggie already in the barn checking on a cow that was close to calving. "Thought you might be up early," Maggie said without turning around. Never could sleep well before a big change either. They worked together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes from months of shared labor. When the cow was settled, they walked out into the cool morning air, watching the sun paint the eastern horizon. "I brought you something," Maggie said, handing Ayako a thick envelope. "Technical manuals, tractor operation, combined maintenance, agricultural machinery repair. Figured they might not be easy to come by in Japan, assuming you ever get a chance to use them." Ayako took the envelope with both hands, the gesture feeling inadequate for the weight of what was being offered. "I do not know if I will ever—" "Maybe you won't," Maggie interrupted. "Maybe you'll spend the rest of your life doing whatever Japanese women are supposed to do, and these will just gather dust somewhere. But maybe, someday, there will be an opportunity. A farm that needs management, a machine that needs an operator, a moment when someone needs to know that women can do this work and do it well. If that moment comes, I want you to have the technical knowledge to seize it." She pulled out a second smaller item, a photograph. It showed Ayako on the tractor mid-field, the massive machine dwarfed by the endless Kansas sky. Maggie had taken it without Ayako's knowledge sometime in August. "Proof," Maggie said simply, "for yourself, if nobody else. Proof that you did this, that you were capable. That, whatever anyone tells you about women's limitations, you know the truth." Ayako stared at the photograph, seeing herself as she had become. Competent, confident, a woman operating machinery with the kind of casual mastery that spoke of genuine skill rather than merely following instructions. This was not the proper Japanese woman she had been raised to be. This was not the decorative, helpless American woman the propaganda had promised. This was something else entirely, something she had no name for in either language. "In Japan," she said slowly, They will say I was corrupted by American values, that I forgot my place, abandoned my culture, became something shameful. Will they be right? Ayako considered this, really considered it, looking past the easy answers to the complicated truth beneath. No, she said finally. I did not forget my culture. I learned that my culture had forgotten something important, that capability has no gender, that limiting people by arbitrary characteristics is not just unjust, it is wasteful. Japan mobilized women for war work because they had no choice, but they treated it as shameful necessity rather than recognition of capacity. They crippled themselves with their own prejudices. She looked at Maggie, this strange American woman who had taught her more than any instructor in her military service. You did not corrupt me. You showed me what I was capable of, what any woman might be capable of given opportunity and training. Whether I can use that knowledge, whether Japanese society will ever allow me to use it, I do not know, but I am not ashamed of having learned it. Maggie smiled, and for once the expression was neither sardonic nor guarded, but genuinely warm. Good, because you earned every bit of that knowledge. You worked harder than most hired hands I've had, learned faster, asked better questions. Your gender had nothing to do with it. Your competence did. They stood together, watching the sunrise, two women from profoundly different worlds who had found common ground in the elemental realities of work, skill, and mutual respect. The others, Ayako said, gesturing toward the bunkhouse where her fellow prisoners were packing their meager belongings. They think this was all aberration, wartime anomaly. They believe that American women will return to proper feminine roles when the men come home, that everything will return to natural order. They might be right, Maggie admitted. There's already pressure. Factories laying off women first. Magazines full of articles about the importance of homemaking. Politicians talking about how women need to give jobs back to veterans. The backlash is real. But you will not give up the farm. Hell no. They'll have to pry it from my cold, dead hands. Maggie's voice was fierce. This is mine. I built it. I sustained it. I made it profitable. My husband, when he gets back, if he gets back, knows better than to suggest I should hand it over to male management. But I'm lucky. I have legal ownership, financial independence, and a sufficiently terrifying reputation that most folks don't push too hard. She turned to face Ayako directly. Most women won't be that lucky. Most will be pushed back into domestic roles, told their war work was appreciated but temporary, given gold watches and sent home to make babies. Some will go willingly, glad to leave the factories and the fields. Others will fight it. A few might even win their fights. But the overall direction, probably back toward traditional roles, at least for a while. Then what was the point? Ayako asked, and she wasn't sure if she was asking about American women or herself. What was the point of proving capability if society will refuse to acknowledge it? The point, Maggie said firmly, is that once you know what you're capable of, nobody can make you truly believe you're incapable. They can force you into certain roles. They can limit your opportunities. They can make it costly and difficult to exercise your skills. But they can't make you believe their lies about your limitations. Not if you've already proven those limits false. She gestured at the farm, the machinery, the productive land stretching to the horizon. I grew up being told women couldn't manage large operations, couldn't understand machinery, couldn't make hard business decisions. Then I did all of those things. Now when someone tells me women can't do something, I don't believe them because I have proof, lived experience, that those limits are arbitrary. That changes how you move through the world, even if you can't always change the world itself. It is a lonely kind of knowledge. Sometimes, Maggie agreed, but sometimes you find other women who know it too. Build networks, share information, support each other's competence. It's happening here. Women farmers, women business owners, women who learned skills during the war and don't intend to forget them just because peace came. We may not be able to force society to change overnight, but we can support each other, preserve knowledge, create spaces where women's competence is recognized, even if the broader culture refuses to see it. I do not know if such networks exist in Japan. I do not know if they can exist. Then maybe you help build them. Maybe you become the proof that other women need, the way I'm trying to be proof for you. It won't be easy, probably won't even be possible, not right away. but reconstruction creates opportunities, moments of chaos where old rules might be bent or broken. If you survive, if you find opportunities, if you can exercise your competence even in small ways, that matters. Every woman who demonstrates capability makes it slightly easier for the next one. A truck horn sounded in the distance, the transport that would take the prisoners to the processing center, beginning their long journey home. "That's my ride," Ayako said unnecessarily. "That's your ride," Maggie confirmed. She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ayako shook it. The American gesture of equals, the handshake between two people who respected each other's competence regardless of gender. "Thank you," Ayako said, and the words were utterly inadequate for what she meant. "Thank you for teaching me. Thank you for showing me. Thank you for treating me as capable rather than decorative. Thank you for destroying every lie I believed about women's limitations. Thank you for giving me knowledge I cannot unknow, even though that knowledge will make my life harder." "Thank you for the good work," Maggie replied, equally inadequate and equally understood. "If you ever get a chance, use what you learned. Don't let it die." "I will try." That's all any of us can do. Ayako returned to Japan in December 1945, to a country that was ash and ruin and desperate hunger. Her family had survived, barely, and greeted her return with complicated emotions: relief at her survival, shame at her capture, confusion about what to do with a daughter who had been tainted by prolonged contact with the enemy. She married within a year as expected. Her husband was a minor civil servant in the Occupation Administration, a man who had survived the war through bureaucratic skills rather than combat, who saw in Ayako a wife educated enough to manage household affairs efficiently, but sufficiently humbled by defeat to not cause problems. He was, in most ways, a kind man. He did not beat her, did not excessively restrict her movements, provided adequately within the constraints of post-war scarcity. By the standards of the time and place, she was fortunate. But lying beside him at night, Ayako would remember the sound of a tractor engine, the satisfaction of a clean gear shift, the Kansas horizon stretching endlessly under a sky that had seemed, for a few brief months, to contain infinite possibility. The technical manuals Maggie had given her, she hid carefully, knowing her husband would not understand. The photograph of herself on the tractor she kept in a locked box along with her military documentation, evidence of a person she had been, proof that the boundaries she lived within were constructed rather than natural. For years, she lived a conventional life. She bore 3 children, managed a household, performed the duties expected of a post-war Japanese wife. To external observers, she was a model of proper femininity, having learned from her wartime aberration and returned to appropriate roles. But she taught her daughters mathematics. She taught them to understand mechanical principles, explaining how engines worked, how systems functioned, how to think logically about technical problems. When her eldest daughter wanted to study engineering at university in the 1960s, a choice still radical but increasingly possible, Ayako supported her absolutely over her husband's protests. "Women do not belong in engineering," he insisted, genuinely bewildered. "Women belong wherever their competence takes them," Ayako replied, and there was steel in her voice that her husband had never heard before, steel forged in a Kansas wheat field 2 decades earlier. She never operated heavy machinery again. She never ran a farm, never managed 800 acres, never felt the particular satisfaction of commanding powerful equipment to productive purpose. The opportunities simply did not exist in her context, and she was not positioned to create them, but she carried the knowledge nonetheless. She carried it in how she raised her daughters, in the quiet support she gave to young women seeking education, in the way she refused to believe societal limitations were natural or inevitable. And sometimes, late at night, she would take out the photograph, a young woman on a tractor, competent and confident, proof that for a few brief months in the chaos of war, the boundaries had been broken and a different world had been possible. That world had closed. The boundaries had reasserted themselves in both America and Japan, though perhaps less absolutely than they might have. The post-war period had pushed women back into domestic roles, had insisted that wartime competence was temporary aberration rather than permanent capacity. But the knowledge remained, the proof existed, and knowledge once gained could never be fully suppressed. It could be buried, restricted, made costly to exercise, but it could not be unmade. Ayako died in 1987, a conventional Japanese woman by all external measures. Her funeral was proper and well attended. Her husband spoke of her as a dutiful wife. Her children, 2 engineers and a physician, mourned her as a mother who had always encouraged their ambitions. Among her possessions, carefully preserved, were technical manuals in English for operating agricultural machinery and a photograph of a young woman on a tractor, proof that capability has no gender, that boundaries are constructed rather than natural, that for a few brief months in Kansas during the last desperate year of a terrible war, one Japanese woman had learned truths that could not be unlearned. Her eldest daughter kept the photograph, framing it in her office at Toyota, where she was one of the first women to reach senior management in Japan's automotive industry. Visitors would sometimes ask about the old photograph, and she would tell them the story, though most people assumed she was embellishing because surely Japanese women hadn't operated heavy machinery in the 1940s, and surely American farms hadn't been run by women during the war. But the photograph was proof. The story was true, and every woman who heard it and saw that image of competence and confidence, they carried forward a small seed of knowledge, a small crack in the edifice of gender limitations. The boundaries had reasserted themselves after the war, but they had been broken once, proven arbitrary rather than natural. And once boundaries are proven arbitrary, they can never again claim the inevitability of natural law. That was Maggie Brennan's gift to Ayako Yamamoto, not the tractor operation skills themselves, though those were valuable, not the technical knowledge, though that was real. But the proof that limitations are constructed, that competence has no gender, that the boundaries people accept as inevitable are often merely the boundaries people have been taught to accept. It was a subversive gift, a dangerous gift, a gift that made life harder even as it made understanding clearer, but it was a gift that could not be taken back, could not be unlearned, could not be suppressed completely, no matter how hard society tried. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Not victory, not revolution, not the wholesale transformation of society's gender expectations, but knowledge, proof, truth, seeds planted in ash waiting for conditions that might, someday, somehow, allow them to grow.